It was a warm Memphis evening, and I was strolling down the street when I spotted Elvis Presley. He was standing outside his car, a sleek black Cadillac that gleamed under the streetlights, but there was something different about him, something that made me do a double take. Elvis had a mustache, I couldn't believe it. Elvis, the king of rock and roll, had grown a mustache. I walked up to him trying to keep a straight face. "Elvis, what's with the mustache?" I teased. He smiled, his famous dimples showing. "Well, my dad had one, so I thought, why can't I have one too?" We both laughed. Elvis was always so easy to talk to. No matter how famous he became, he never lost his down-to-earth charm. He was the kind of guy who would stop and chat with anyone, no matter who they were. As we talked, I couldn't help but think about how much Elvis had changed, yet how much he had stayed the same. He was still the same guy who used to hang out at the fairgrounds, always ready to share a story or a laugh. One night at the fair, a bunch of us were standing around, joking and cutting up. Elvis was wearing a shiny new diamond watch. Jimmy Kingsley, who worked for him, couldn't help but notice it. "That's a new watch," Jimmy said, admiring it. Elvis nodded. "Yeah, got it recently." Jimmy looked at it more closely. "That's a nice-looking watch." Without missing a beat, Elvis took off the watch and handed it to Jimmy. "You like it? Here, take it." Jimmy was stunned. "Elvis, what are you doing?" "You know how I am," Elvis said with a grin. "If someone admires something I've got, I've just got to let them have it." We all learned to be careful what we said around Elvis after that. He was so generous that you never knew what he might give away next. Elvis had a special bond with the police officers in Memphis. One night I was with LT, Jim Pug, at the Crosstown Theater when Elvis walked in. He spotted us and came over, chatting like we were old friends. Elvis and Pug had even trained in karate together, and Elvis always spoke highly of him. But the most touching moment I ever saw was when Elvis heard about the sudden death of Inspector Fred Woodward, a close friend and his former bodyguard. The day Inspector Woodward died, Elvis had called and left a message for him to come to Graceland. We never found out what he wanted to talk about, but it must have been important. On the day of Inspector Woodward's funeral, Elvis asked Lieutenant Pat Adams to pick him up in a squad car and take him to the Memphis funeral home. As we drove, Elvis talked about how far he had come in his career, but he seemed more concerned about how he was doing as a person. He asked me if I thought he was still doing a good job. "Elvis, you don't need to worry about that," I reassured him. "You're the king of rock and roll, and everyone around the world knows it." Elvis smiled, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. He missed his friend. After the funeral, we found out that Elvis had bought and paid for Inspector Woodward's casket without telling anyone. It was a small but powerful gesture that showed just how much Elvis cared about his friends. During the holiday season, Elvis loved to spend time with his family and close friends. One New Year's Eve, we gathered at Graceland for a night of fun and fireworks. Elvis sent one of his guys to West Memphis, Arkansas, to buy a bunch of fireworks because it was illegal to buy them in Tennessee. We set up in the backyard and had a Roman candle fight. It was hilarious, and we all ended up with holes in our clothes from the flying sparks. One year, I got hit in the eye with a Roman candle. It hurt like crazy, and I had to go inside to wash it out. Elvis came down to check on me, and we ended up talking for hours. It was a special moment, just the two of us, sharing stories and jokes. As the years went by, Elvis and I drifted apart, but I never forgot the times we shared. Whether it was a mustache, a diamond watch, or a night of fireworks, Elvis always made every moment memorable. And that's the Elvis I'll always remember. Patrolman Bobby Gray will never forget the night in 1968 when he pulled over a long, black limousine for making a prohibited turn on Cooper Street. As he approached the car, the driver got out, looking worried. Bobby explained the minor infraction, and the driver replied, "Man, I just didn't know. I was on my way to take Elvis to the theater." Bobby was stunned. Since he has Elvis in the car, I must have done something wrong by stopping him, he thought. But he decided to let it slide, and asked for a tour of the car instead. The limousine was all white inside, with a built-in bar and hidden shot glasses. Elvis was sitting in the back, and they chatted for a bit. Elvis thanked Bobby for not giving a ticket, and explained they were heading to the Memphian Theater for a get-together. Bobby wished them a good night and let them go. Lieutenant E.W. Hudgens had a unique encounter with Elvis one late night when his officers stopped him for speeding. Elvis was riding a three-wheeled vehicle with a Volkswagen engine. The officers were unsure what to do, so Hudgens asked if anyone else was on the street. When they said no, he told them to give Elvis a warning and let him go home. Patrolman Ronnie Rogers met Elvis by accident during the Cotton Carnival. Ronnie was stationed on Front Street, looking down at the people partying by the river. Someone came up behind him and wished they could join the fun. Ronnie, without turning around, said, "Well, go on down, it's open to the public." The man sounded disappointed, saying, "I can't, people won't leave me alone." Ronnie turned around and was shocked to see Elvis. "You're Elvis," he blurted out. Elvis confirmed it, saying it was a problem. They exchanged a few words and Elvis drove away. Patrolman Terry Phelps often saw Elvis during his midnight shift near Graceland. Elvis would ride along with the officers and even join them for coffee. He became fond of Tootsie Roll Pops and would flag the officers down to get a few. Elvis had a lot of respect for the police and would stay close to them in South Memphis at night. Patrolman J.J. Rogers first met Elvis in the early 70s when he was working in Midtown. Elvis would go to the movies at the Crosstown and Memphian theaters. J.J. and his shift took karate lessons from Red West and Bill Wallace, who ran Tennessee karate above the White Way Pharmacy. Elvis owned the place and J.J. got to know Red well and was invited to the movies. One day, J.J. and his partner were off duty and riding their motorcycles when they decided to stop by Graceland. They told the guard at the gate that Elvis had invited them, but the guard was skeptical. After a brief conversation, the guard called up to the house, and Elvis said to let them in. J.J. and his partner were given a tour of Graceland by Elvis himself. They ended up going to Tennessee karate with Elvis, where he showed them his collection of police badges, including one from Tupelo, Mississippi, which he was especially proud of. Patrolman O.W. Stewart and his partner once encountered Elvis driving a white Cadillac with Red West and Master Kang Ree. Elvis asked for an escort to Kang Ree's studio, and they agreed to give a directional escort. While en route, they received a hold-up call and had to make a quick U-turn. Elvis followed, making the same turn and nearly hitting pedestrians. Another officer, John Stevens, pulled Elvis over but let him go when he recognized him. Elvis arrived at the scene of the holdup and drew more attention than the actual incident. Later, they were invited to a party at Elvis' house. Elvis was known for his interest in police work. Patrolman J.J. Rogers often saw Elvis ride with the guys, especially the narcotics squad. Elvis carried a pistol and even donated $1,000 to help with a robbery conference in Nashville. He also helped the police softball team by providing equipment when they couldn't afford it. Elvis was generous, giving Christmas gifts to officers who patrolled the Graceland area and even giving Cher, F. Bill Morris, a new Mercedes-Benz. One night, Patrolman Fred Frederick received a pistol from his friend Jim Kingsley, who worked for Elvis. Elvis had bought it in Arizona and given it to Jim. Elvis would often give weapons to members of his Memphis Mafia, including Delbert West, Red West, Jim Kingsley, Richard Davis, and Joe Esposito. Patrolman George Olive once stopped Elvis for making a prohibited turn. Elvis was wearing his signature white outfit and showed George a diamond ring he had just bought. Elvis let George try it on, but he returned it. They chatted, and Elvis drove away without a ticket. Another time, George stopped Elvis near the Memphian Theater, where he was riding a three-wheeled motorcycle. They talked, and Elvis was one of the nicest people George had ever met. Patrolman Ronnie Rogers had another memorable encounter with Elvis one night on the midnight shift. A car zoomed out of Graceland's gates, and Ronnie and his partner had to swerve to avoid it. They caught up with the car and pulled it over. It was Elvis, and he asked for an escort to Madison Cadillac to trade in some cars. They radioed for backup, and as they drove down the interstate with 2 squad cars and a fleet of Cadillacs, Elvis rolled down his window and asked for a lollipop. Ronnie and his partner handed one over, and Elvis drove off with his cars. The Memphis Police Department had its fair share of unusual encounters, but nothing quite compared to the times when Elvis Presley would show up. For officers, it was a mix of excitement and a bit of unease. especially since Elvis was known for his unpredictable behavior and sudden appearances. Sergeant Bob Ferguson remembered the days when Assistant Chief Rout wanted to form a police band. Chief Rout, a man with a military background, had big plans. Ferguson initially thought it was a bit much, but the hidden talents of the officers surprised everyone. They formed a 16-piece orchestra, one of the last big bands in the country. From 1969 to 1972, they played at community centers, parks, churches, schools, and even the Mid-South Fair. One night, while practicing in the old police station basement, Chief Rout announced that Elvis wanted to come down and practice with him. The reaction was surprisingly subdued. Everyone just sort of mumbled, but Ferguson knew it could happen. However, a new mayor and chief of police came in, and the band was disbanded. It was a shame because the band had been a great public relations tool. Sergeant Roy Milliken had his own Elvis story. In the early 1970s, he flew helicopters for the police department and often saw Jerry Lee Lewis, who flew out of the same area. Milliken found Jerry Lee to be a down-to-earth guy, unlike Elvis. One winter afternoon, Milliken heard Elvis was coming in. When Elvis arrived, he looked unwell. Despite this, he took the time to shake hands and sign an autograph for Milliken's kids. Later, Milliken learned that Elvis was checking himself into the hospital. He had canceled his shows in Vegas and was heading home. Patrolman Al Black was assigned to motorcycles after his first 3 years with the police department. That's when he met Elvis through a friend named Bryce Norwood. They'd hang out at Graceland, and on Sundays they'd ride motorcycles with Elvis through Whitehaven. Elvis had a new Harley Sportster, and he was always fun to be around. Officer Crawford and Black escorted Elvis to every Grizzlies football game. One night, Elvis showed up in a blue Lincoln with blue lights and a siren. He was acting strange, doing karate kicks in the elevator. It was a bit scary, but Elvis was apologetic. In the stadium box, he ate 2 large pizzas, a bunch of peanuts, and drank Stag beer. He even bought a new Pontiac for a nurse he had met just a few days earlier. Patrolman O.W. Stewart had a memorable night when he and his partner were leaving a hold-up scene. They saw Elvis pulling into a karate studio. They decided to stop in, and Elvis was showing off his new moves. Stewart had to be his punching bag, and Elvis didn't quite stop his fist in front of Stewart's face. It hurt, but it was a story to tell. Patrolman Ronnie Rogers was on the football team in the Park Commission League. He called Elvis to see if he would sponsor the team. Elvis agreed, and Rogers went to Elvis' dad's house to get the details. Vernon told him to go to York Arms, and sure enough, they charged everything to Elvis. The team was set. Patrolman Wellborn Marr was working the midnight shift at the old police station when Elvis walked in. He asked how everyone was doing and then went to visit the prisoners. It was a brief but memorable encounter. Patrolman Art Yeager and his partner were directing traffic at an accident when Elvis came over to offer help. He waited by his car, but they didn't need assistance. Elvis was talkative and had gained some weight, but he was still the same friendly guy. Patrolman L.W. Brackeen was handling traffic at an accident on I-240 when Elvis pulled up in a white limousine. He offered to buy a new pickup truck for the man trapped in the accident. Brackeen noticed Elvis had gained weight and joked about it, but Elvis was in high spirits. Lieutenant Arch Arkin occasionally met with Elvis when he came into town. Elvis would give him a bunch of traffic tickets and the money to pay the fines. Elvis didn't want to go uptown himself, so he trusted Arkin to handle it. Patrolman Robert Hare knew Red West, Elvis' bodyguard, from high school. When Red was in town, they'd hang out and sometimes go to Elvis' house or the Malco Theater. Hare could have joined Elvis on his trips, but he didn't want it to seem like he was just using his friendship for benefits. Patrolman Sam McCachran remembered a time when Elvis stopped his car to talk to them. He had a pistol, but the officers didn't do anything. Elvis would show his Secret Service badge when questioned about his gun. He was just a good all-country boy, curious about what the police were doing. Patrolman Joe Dunn had a surprising encounter one night. He and his partner were cruising near Graceland when a car pulled up. The driver was an attractive lady, and a middle-aged man was sitting next to her. She asked if they had seen Elvis. Dunn thought she was just a fan, but she revealed she was Priscilla Presley, looking for her husband. Later that night, they ran into Elvis at a Howard Johnson Motor Inn, but they didn't report back to the mansion. Patrolman John Botting once delivered a message to Elvis from George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. The guard at Graceland wouldn't let him in, so he went to Elvis' father's home. Elvis' stepmother, Dee, delivered the message. Patrolman Robert Peel had a unique routine on Sunday mornings. He'd drive behind Graceland to feed apples and carrots to Elvis' horses. One day, while feeding the horses, Elvis came out in a long robe. They talked for a while about the horses, and that was it. No talk of music or movies, just a friendly chat about horses. These encounters with Elvis were a mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary, a testament to the unique bond between the king of rock and roll and the Memphis Police Department. Elvis Presley was more than just a music icon. To those who knew him, he was a real person with a big heart and a complex personality. Here are a few stories that show different sides of Elvis. One Sunday morning, a man went to feed the horses at a stable. Elvis would often come to the window or step outside to wave. The man thought Elvis was just making sure he wasn't a threat to the horses. Even though Elvis never came out to talk, he seemed like a nice guy. Patrolman Ben Keithley had a unique encounter with Elvis in 1973 or 1974. He was investigating a car accident at 2 in the morning when Elvis drove up and offered to help. Ben was impressed by Elvis's willingness to assist, even though he was a famous star. When Patrolman Bruce Holbrook was 16, he worked the sound system at a wedding at Trinity Baptist Church. He was surprised to see Elvis Presley there as the best man for one of his bodyguards. Bruce remembered seeing Elvis playing football with neighborhood kids and riding his Harley Davidson without a helmet. It was clear that Elvis was just a regular guy in some ways. Lieutenant Flip Palmer once flew to California to pick up a prisoner. On the plane, he saw Elvis in first class with a group of girls. Elvis had long hair, which Flip found a bit disappointing. Despite this, Elvis recognized him and they spoke briefly. It was the last time Flip saw Elvis. Patrolman Jimmy Kelly was on duty in 1975 when a 7-Eleven store was robbed. When he and his partner arrived, they found a white and black Cadillac limo parked outside. Inside the store, they discovered Elvis interviewing a witness. Elvis, a reserve police officer, handed over the information and left, leaving the officers to handle the situation. Patrolman J.J. Todd had a memorable experience with Elvis in August 1975. After getting off duty early, Todd saw a Stutz car with California plates. He thought it might be Elvis or Isaac Hayes. They ended up in a spontaneous drag race, with Elvis driving the Stutz. When they got to a red light, Elvis's car slid into the intersection, and Todd thought they might crash. Elvis's uncle, Vester, was panicking, but Elvis was laughing. They eventually parted ways, with Todd deciding not to press charges for the race. Patrolman Al Black noticed that Elvis became more paranoid after the Grizzlies folded. He wouldn't go down to the gate to see people anymore and would run from his car to the house. When it was time to leave for a performance, Elvis would run to the car. Al believed Elvis was always scared someone might shoot him. Ronnie Trout, a police boxing coach, was at the sheriff's department near Christmas in 1975 when Elvis came by with his entourage. Elvis received a beautiful belt buckle from Sheriff Nixon, and in return, Elvis gave everyone a TCB necklace. Ronnie, who had known Elvis since school, treasures the necklace he received. J.J. Rogers had a tense night with Elvis in 1975. After a concert in Pontiac, Michigan, they went to watch a movie. Elvis was in a good mood until J.J. mentioned a man who had been arrested for threatening to kill him. Elvis's mood changed instantly, and he stormed into the theater. J.J. stayed in the lobby, but soon Elvis's men called him to the manager's office. Elvis was furious and ordered J.J. to call Detroit to get information on the man who had threatened him. J.J. followed Elvis's instructions, and a few days later, they received the report. Elvis wanted to keep a record of everyone who had ever threatened him. Patrolman R.T. Logan had an encounter with Elvis in the spring of 1976. Logan was on patrol when he pulled over 3 supercycles for not having helmets. One of the riders turned out to be Elvis. Despite the pressure from Elvis's entourage, Logan decided to write citations, believing that everyone should follow the law. Elvis was congenial, but his friends, especially Joe Esposito, were not cooperative. The incident could have been much more serious, but Logan stuck to his duty. These stories show that Elvis Presley was a complex person, with moments of kindness, helpfulness, and even paranoia. To those who knew him, he was more than just a star. He was a friend, a neighbor, and sometimes a challenge. Linda snapped back. "You understand what?" I replied. "I understand you're his girlfriend." Linda's voice turned sarcastic. "Well, what's that supposed to mean?" I could tell the conversation wasn't going anywhere, so I finished writing out the ticket for Linda and handed it to her to sign. She signed it and made a few more smart remarks. Esposito was still standing there, mouthing off about how there wasn't anything wrong with what they had been doing. He seemed to think I should know who they were. He reminded me of someone from a B-rated mafia movie, acting like he was the real deal. I started to reach for my walkie-talkie to call for backup, because things were getting a bit edgy. Then, I went back to Elvis and started writing out his ticket. By then, a crowd of about 50 people had gathered on the sidewalk. Some of them were trying to get out into the street to get Elvis's autograph. I kept telling them to get back up on the sidewalk. After I finished Elvis's ticket, I handed it to him to sign. He signed it, and I still have a copy of it. Elvis's signature was terrible, worse than I had ever seen it before. As he handed the ticket back to me, Elvis said, "I sure hope this doesn't make the paper." I told him, "Mr. Presley, there's no doubt in my mind this is going to make the paper, TV, radio, and everything else." He looked at me and asked, "What do you mean by that?" I answered, "Mr. Presley, you know what I mean." Elvis didn't say anything else. I tore his copy of the ticket out of my book and handed it to him. One of the bodyguards, who had been a cop in California, drove one of the motorcycles home. The other bodyguard drove Linda's, and Esposito drove his own. Elvis and Linda got into the black limousine and left. I was right. The story hit the papers. Elvis had been stopped and issued a citation. The city attorney, Art Shee, made a comment to the newspapers that Tennessee state law didn't require a new vehicle to have a registration tag for 15 days. I read that and thought, that's odd. A few days later, I called one of the newspaper reporters. I said, the last thing in the article was a remark from the city attorney saying Elvis didn't have to have a registration plate. No one's contacted me to ask my response to that. The reporter was surprised that I had a response. I said, yeah, I certainly do. My response to that particular aspect of the traffic citation is that if Art Shee was correct, then the state of Tennessee has been carrying on a fraud for the last 30 years, because every time a vehicle is purchased, the state requires a temporary tag be bought before the vehicle can be driven off the lot. The reporter met me at the precinct the next day and asked what my response was. I told him, and it ended up in the paper. I never heard another word from Art Shee's office about the charges. Needless to say, Elvis, Linda, and Esposito never went to court and never paid any fines. That incident didn't do my career any good, but I couldn't back down. Elvis had to obey the law like everyone else. One night, around 3 in the morning during the summer of 1976, I was on Highway 61 in Horn Lake, Mississippi, when I saw 2 motorcycles at an Exxon station. Both motorcycles had nice-looking women on the back. I pulled over to the pumps to talk to them. When I got out of the squad car, I discovered one of the drivers was Elvis Presley. He was friendly and showed me his driver's license. We talked about the police department, and he even showed me his police badge. Since Elvis was who he was, I asked if he would mind if I wrote him a ticket. It was more of a joke. He offered me his driver's license, and I wrote him a ticket. I don't remember what charge I put on it, but Elvis signed it. My ex-wife took it with her when she moved to New Jersey. Elvis and his crew liked to come out to the firing range periodically and shoot. They enjoyed firearms, and if you visit Graceland, you can see what's left of their firing range. One day, they came out in a very plush, large Chevrolet pickup. It was a 1976 4-door crew cab. It was a very attractive and exciting vehicle. I mentioned how unusual it was, and one of the guys asked if I wanted to drive it. I took him up on the offer and drove the truck to the top of the hill and back. The next day, I was at the range by myself when I heard a vehicle pull up. I looked outside and saw the same truck. Billy Smith, one of Elvis's employees, was getting out. He asked if I knew anyone who could fix a scratch on the truck. I said I knew someone who would probably fix it, and not even charge. Billy told me it was my responsibility to fix the truck. I was confused and upset, but then he started laughing. He explained that Elvis had called from Las Vegas and found out I had driven the truck and really liked it. Elvis said, "Get the truck ready and take it out to him. Tell him it's his with my compliments and apologize for me personally because I can't be there. I sure would like to see the look on his face." The sheriff let me keep the truck because it was a very unusual situation. The license and title were in Elvis's name, so the gift was legal. I always appreciated the truck. It was a magnificent thing to happen to a young sergeant. I'll always remember it. Elvis was known to ask for things that were a bit unusual. One time, I took photographs of a female suspect, dressed as a male who was robbing a grocery store. We caught her the next night, after she tried to rob another store. I told Elvis about the incident, and he kept asking me to send him some of the photos. I showed him the pictures, and he sat there for an hour looking at them. He kept asking me to give him some of the photos. I told him, "I can't give these photographs to you, Elvis. They're evidence." He kept asking, and I kept saying no. Finally, I asked, "What would you do with the pictures if you did have them?" He said, "Well, I'll put them in my bathroom upstairs." I was shocked. I said, "Don't you have better pictures than these for your bathroom?" He just said, "Yeah, but those are really neat pictures." The last concert Elvis did in Memphis on July 5, 1976, was a big deal. It was a sold-out crowd, and more security was needed at Graceland to keep fans from trying to get on the premises. I volunteered to work an overtime detail at his house, and got there around 9 o'clock that night. I patrolled the grounds using the little golf cart Elvis owned. Elvis had a couple of his Stutz automobiles parked out behind his mansion. One was pretty well damaged on the front end, but the other one was brand new. I discovered someone on his staff had driven one of the Stutz cars to get it washed, and had crashed the front end into the back end of another car. I saw Elvis and his group return from the Coliseum that night. He was wearing his white jumpsuit and rushed into the house. Later that night, a hard thunderstorm blew in. One night in the summer of 1977, my friend Emmy Rose called and woke me up. She was a teacher of mind control and psychic awareness, and had a premonition about Elvis. She was upset and wanted me to go down to Graceland and contact someone, because something was going to happen to him. I felt a little foolish, but called the South Precinct, and asked some officers to patrol the area around Graceland. I was on the desk at the North Precinct when I got a call from LT Louise Dunavant. She asked if I was still a friend of Elvis's. I said I hadn't been to Graceland since about 1974. She told me about a vision and said, "Something is wrong. Something bad is going to happen to Elvis. He needs to be warned." I didn't know what to tell her. She was really worried. We needed a sponsor for our league fast pitch softball team. So I stopped by one morning to see if Elvis wanted to sponsor us. Sometimes it was hard to get in touch with him, so I asked Red West if he'd ask Elvis if he wanted to sponsor our team. Red called back and said Elvis would do it. He told me to go to Dowdle Sports Store, get what we needed, and have the bills sent to Elvis at Graceland. The first time I went to Dowdle, Red went along to help me set up the account. I bought 2 complete sets of uniforms, balls, bats, probably about $3,000 worth of stuff. We had a really good team. Elvis never came to any of the games, but I'd tell him sometimes how the season was going. Red was on our roster, and played several games with us. One day I called Red and told him we needed a player. He said, "I don't work for Elvis anymore." That's when I found out Red had written a book about Elvis with Dave Hebler and Sonny West, and had been fired. But Red got to thinking and said, "Well, I'm not going to let y'all down. I'll play a game, but I'm not going to put his name on me another time after today." So Red came out and played with us after he'd been fired, but he stuck to his word and never played any more after that. At the end of the season, I needed to buy a resin bag. I went to Dowdle, and the man I had been buying equipment from said, "Jay, we got a problem with your account." I asked, "What is it?" He said, "Well, they're refusing to pay the bills." Since the bill was around $3,000, I got really nervous. I thought I'd better call Graceland and see what I could find out. I'd never talked to Vernon Presley and never met him. So I called and asked to speak to Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin, whom I knew was in town. Whoever answered the phone said, "Hold on a minute." When the voice on the line said, "Sergeant Rogers," I said, "Hey Billy, how you doing?" Then I heard, "This is not Billy, this is Vernon Presley." I was really nervous. I'd always heard that Vernon Presley was a tough guy to deal with. We're talking more than $3,000 I had signed my name to. Vernon said, "What's this about some ball account bill that keeps being sent to me?" I started to explain, "Well, Red West," but Vernon interrupted me. "Red West doesn't work for us anymore. He doesn't have authority to approve anything like this." I said, "Well, Red didn't approve it, Mr. Presley. Elvis did." Vernon asked, "You've talked to Elvis personally about this?" I said, "Well, actually Red did." Vernon shot back, "Red doesn't work for us." I said, "No, sir, but he did back in the spring. That's when Elvis approved the account, and I've talked to Elvis about our team." Vernon didn't say anything more, and the line went silent. I didn't know what to do. I hoped he would believe me, but I was worried about the bill. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was upset. He didn't know about the bills I had sent. When I told him Elvis said to take care of them, Vernon got even more upset. He kept saying, "This is not how we do business." He was so angry that he froze my account, meaning I couldn't buy anything else. He said he would talk to Elvis over the weekend, and we'd see what happened. I had a really nervous weekend, worried about how I was going to pay the bill. On Monday I called Vernon at his house, but he wasn't there. I left my number at his precinct. When I got home, there was a message to call Vernon back. I was so nervous. I thought he was going to tell me to forget it. When I called, Vernon answered, "Hey J.J, how are you? I talked to Elvis on Saturday night. He told me you're an old friend, one of his police buddies. He said to pay the bill and give you anything you want." I was so relieved. I said, "Wow, Mr. Presley, that's all I needed to hear." Vernon added that Elvis wanted me to call him next year to sponsor the team again. Then he said, "Don't worry about it. The bill has been taken care of." I was so grateful I didn't know what to say, but things weren't all good for Elvis. His friend Red came to town and told me that Elvis was taking a lot of drugs, mostly prescription ones. Red was really worried because he thought Elvis was getting addicted. It was a tough time for everyone. Lieutenant Arch Arkin remembered the last time he met Elvis. It was during the summer of 1977, and Elvis didn't look well. He wasn't the same Elvis that Arkin knew. Billy Gober, a court clerk, said Elvis loved to wear jumpsuits, especially police jumpsuits. On August 15, 1977, Billy's boss, Tommy Morgan, had some new jumpsuits with sheriff department patches. He was going to take them to Elvis, but Elvis never got to wear them because he had gained weight. Lieutenant the 5th, L. Lane, heard stories about Elvis using drugs, but he didn't have any direct proof. The police had that information on file, though. On the afternoon of August 16, 1977, Private Ulysses Jones and his partner, Charlie Crosby, got a call to go to Graceland. They thought it might be Elvis's dad, Vernon, but when they got there, they found Elvis on the bathroom floor. People were doing CPR trying to save him. Ulysses kept doing chest compressions, and he heard a doctor say, "Breathe, Elvis, breathe." That's when Ulysses knew it was Elvis. Patrolman John Botting and his partner, W.W. McDaniel, were the first police officers to arrive at Graceland. McDaniel stayed at the gates, and Botting went inside. Sergeant Jimmy Willis, who worked in the homicide division, got the call about Elvis at 3:40. He thought Elvis might have overdosed on drugs, like many others had heard. Patrolman Ronnie Rogers was called to Baptist Memorial Hospital, and Sergeant Roy Milliken, who worked the 4 p.m. to midnight shift, was also sent there. The crowd outside the hospital was huge, and the police had to take control. Patrolman Mike Fuller was at roll call when they heard the news about Elvis. He was assigned to crowd control and the funeral detail. The police department went on 12-hour shifts for the next few days. Lieutenant Sam McCachran and his team went to the hospital and then to Graceland to investigate. They talked to Ginger Alden, Elvis's girlfriend, who found him unconscious in the bathroom. They looked for any signs of foul play, but found nothing. Sergeant Roy Milliken described the room where Elvis was found. It was a huge closet off his bedroom, filled with clothes and police paraphernalia. Ginger told them that she and Elvis had played racquetball until 4 a.m. and then went to bed. Elvis had been reading a book about sex and psychology when he was found. Lieutenant Sam McCachran and his team concluded that Elvis's death was natural. The coroner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, ruled that Elvis died of cardiac arrhythmia. The police closed their investigation. Patrolman Ronnie Rogers was assigned to watch over Elvis's body at the funeral home. He saw how the undertakers treated everyone the same, rich or poor. It made him realize that everyone ends up in the same place eventually. Patrolman Jerry Turner was inside the funeral home, making sure no one disturbed Elvis's body. It was a tough job, but he knew it was important. Elvis's death was a shock to everyone, and the world mourned him. The police and the people of Memphis did their best to ensure that his memory was honored. The stories of Elvis Presley and his friends in the Memphis Police Department are a testament to the deep connections that can form between a celebrity and the community he called home. Elvis was more than just a rock star to the officers. He was a friend, a neighbor, and a part of their lives. From the early days when Elvis moved to Memphis with his family, to the tragic day of his death, the police and fire departments played crucial roles in his life and legacy. Sergeant Jimmy Willis and Patrolman Ronnie Rogers recalled the harrowing night, when Elvis' body was almost stolen from the cemetery. The police had to set up a decoy hearse to protect Elvis' remains, while the real hearse sneaked out the back. The city was on high alert, and the culprits were eventually caught and arrested. The love and respect for Elvis were so profound that even in death, his safety remained a priority. Patrolman Jack Wallace and Patrolman Mike Fuller shared their experiences guarding Elvis' casket at Graceland. The mansion was open to the public, and thousands of fans, including celebrities and politicians, came to pay their respects. The crowd was immense, and the officers had to work tirelessly to maintain order. Despite the chaos, moments of warmth and humanity shone through, like when Elvis' father, Vernon, allowed fans to view his son's body. Private Ulysses Jones remembered the heat and the chaos outside Graceland, where fans fainted and the police had to call for reinforcements. The fans' love for Elvis was so intense that they would do anything for a souvenir, even pulling up plugs of grass from his yard. Inside the mansion, officers were allowed to see Elvis one last time, but the sight was heartbreaking. It was a somber reminder of the loss they all felt. Policewoman Lynn Lovett summed up the impact Elvis had on the community. For her, his death felt like losing a part of her family. Elvis wasn't just a star. He was a part of the fabric of Memphis. His kindness and generosity were legendary, like when he brought turkey and all the fixings to the officers on duty during Christmas. Lieutenant Jim Sinclair noted that Elvis was listed as an Honorary Reserve Police Captain in the department's special order, even after his death. This honor reflected the mutual respect and friendship between Elvis and the police. The legacy of Elvis Presley extends far beyond his music. It's a story of community, friendship, and the profound impact one person can have on those around them. The officers and firefighters who knew Elvis will always remember him not just as the king of rock and roll, but as a friend who brought joy and warmth to their lives. Years after his death, the memory of Elvis lives on, not just in the hearts of his fans, but in the stories and memories of the men and women who served and protected him. These stories are a tribute to a man who touched the lives of so many, and whose spirit continues to inspire and connect people across generations.